How do we know it's working?
We have to ask. Hey, does it work? Can you all hear us? Are we online? No, it doesn't. Okay.
Don't we have to go to YouTube first?
We are here on YouTube. I will just copy the link and we'll try it here. Then we have like a safety patch.
How do we know it's working?
Okay, it's working. We have to ask. I guess it's just a time, you know? Okay. Welcome, we are live. Okay. Let's have like a nice picture. Come here. Okay. Welcome to the second try of the small talks with Rita Guimarães. Rita is in our class, the class bereits continues. We're studying room concepts, like based on videos, and she is most of the time like doing artworks to participate, like to go deeper into the concept of participation. Correct me if you have to add something also. And like working mostly with video, I would say.
Yeah.
And today we will talk about your work that you exhibit. It's the Tule project. And maybe we could show it first, right? We have an installation.
Yeah, maybe let's show the installation shots.
Here we go. Here you can see like there's a lot of earth on which you like walk to see the film that is showing here. And the film is like, can you talk? I'm so sorry. Would you want to introduce the film that you show on the show?
Yeah, sure. So now you stop me talking if I talk too much, but it's the video documentation of a project I'm currently coordinating called the Future Memorial, so Zukünftiges Denkmal für die Geduldeten Afghanen. The name doesn't work as well in English because Geduldeten doubles in German as people who are living under the legal status of a Duldung and tolerated, and the adjective tolerated. And it basically pertains as a memorial to the way that in the present we, as European citizens represented by our European governments, are treating Afghani people both in Afghanistan and outside of Afghanistan through the European border and asylum complex. So I think it is something to regret, hence the memorial. And because I don't know exactly why, I was going to say because the conflict in Afghanistan, or the conflict and the violence in Afghanistan is less visible, but I'm not sure that accounts for the full explanation. Even though for a lot of years Afghanistan was ruled the unsafest country in the world by the UN, Afghani asylum requests are, until the fall of the government, were still being denied at a much higher rate than asylum requests and subsidiary protection requests by people with other points of origin. And what you get when your asylum request is denied is very often something called a duldung, which is a suspension of the deportation order. And duldungs are unfortunately a very flexible tool. Like there's 30-something types of duldung. I think you have Ausbildung duldungs where you can still like study and work, and you have duldung lights where you can't rent, you can't study, and you can't work. And there's a lot of them in between. And the way that these cases are usually decided upon is very dependent on the Landeskreis that you're a part of, so the local government of the place where you first registered when you came to Germany. And there's like one of the organizations I worked with is Refugium e.V. in Braunschweig, and they use the example of, you know, if you're in Braunschweig, you get a more permissive Landeskreis than if you're in Wedel. That's just 10 kilometers away. And this really changes the framework and the tools that you have to be able to defend yourself against this legal limbo and against potentially deportation. And this, I first got engaged with this topic because this touched someone that lives with me. And it was very shocking to me how invisible it was. So we came up with this language for a memorial together, where we plant red tulips across public spaces in Germany.
And may I interrupt here?
Yes.
Like, for me, it's clear that this process has been going on for already like 2 years. Can you, like, maybe, you started with this trend. How did it evolve? And how do you work with the people throughout the way? And how did it maybe change over the time?
So I think it's that's the thing with participative works. I think you need to have a safe base and space and capacity in the framework to hold a space for people that are coming from different personal contexts and personal political geographies. I think this is very fundamental to try to equalize the terrain of participation within your work. But then it's a lot trial and error when it comes to aesthetics, like seeing which types of experience are more touching or more beautiful together, and realizing what was missing in one action to then replicate it in another. And when you get different requests from different contexts or organizations to cooperate with you, or you take the initiative to go to different contexts and different organizations, you don't always predict at first how things are going to unravel on the field. So one of the groups that I worked with was the Prinzessengarten Collective in Moritzplatz in Berlin, and they have people coming to plant stuff and do some gardening every day. And I did this with 2 schools, and the way that the kids were behaving around the flowers and around the planting and choosing the place to plant was very different than what an adult might do. And this is something that then you just have to be a little bit flexible and improvise with. And for me, it's also very important to have an opening moment and a closing moment. So to have like a welcoming moment where you say a few words about what is being done today and you thank people for being there, and a closing moment where you maybe share poetry, story, some food, something to just bring the moment to a close without being like this slightly violent dramatic break.
Yeah.
And I wanted to add, because I don't think I said it in the beginning, like the red tulip or the tulip is the national flower of Afghanistan. This is why we picked it.
Before. I think it's because we did the talk already before. We were like, I want to give an overview, like what does it actually mean to do the memorial? Like, you are planting tulips. So like you can go on explaining like why exactly these tulips and of which context they come, and how it has to do with like what is actually happening is like there are workshops to plant tulips, there is like a togetherness, like organizations coming together, there's like food there. Like, can you talk more about the actual like
the
process? And the artwork to a person that wouldn't know it. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay, I think for me it's a bit easier to depart from the conceptual frame to then go into the these practical logistics, like how it materializes on the field. So like I was saying, we picked the red tulip because the tulip is the national flower of Afghanistan, and the red tulip has a particular significance in the Nowruz festivities, so the Persian New Year festivities in the north of Afghanistan. And I thought it was a fortunate coincidence that it's a flower that is also very present in Western iconography that came to Western countries and to this part of Europe in particular through basically colonial trade. But it's a flower that we've allowed, or a body that we've allowed to lay roots within our borders. And then the tulip in itself as a flower has changed a lot through intentional manipulation by humans. So then I also tried to go search for species of tulips that are botanical tulips, or meaning wild tulips, instead of the hybrids, like the very tall, big hybrids that we see in gardens. Botanical tulips are the more original tulip sort that are smaller mountain flowers that are closer to the ground. And I looked for species that grow within Afghanistan, and then I asked Mutaz, my housemate, which ones he recognized.
Yeah.
And that's how we made the selection. And botanical tulips actually bloom more than just 1 year, which is an advantage. And then when it comes to the practicals of planning the planting actions, I try to prepare little bundles of tulips if it's in autumn, so just the onions, just the bulbs. If it's in spring, small, already rooted bulbs that have a little green thing on top, so a growing tulip on biologically decomposable cups that people can take. And we do essentially two types of actions. So there's actual planting actions in concrete spaces, and there's pickup actions where people go to a certain place and pick up some tulips, a pamphlet, some stickers, and then go put it where they feel like it makes sense. And when I organize the actions, I try to create productive crosses between different universes. Like, I think this cross-pollination of resources and knowledge is productive. So first off, it doesn't make any sense to do any of this without contact with Afghani organizations.
Yes.
Like, basic. And it makes sense that they also get to benefit from a little, like, whatever little attention the project generates. Then I try to contact different activist groups that are connected to border policy. And in Berlin, there was, for instance, the No Border Assembly. And then I tried to go to include a more neutral space. So in Berlin, that was, for instance, the volunteer pool of Republic Berlin, which is a housing project, or an exhibition space like TIA, the Institute for Inductive Research, which, when I say neutral, of course, these places are not neutral and they are politicized, but their activities have a very broad scope, and they touch people who may not necessarily be so familiar with these problematics. And I don't know, I'm a big believer that the easiest way to change minds and generate solidarity is through personal encounters. So this is kind of what I try to do.
And like, how do you feel, like, what is the difference, like now going, like, I feel like you're going bigger, you're like saying, okay, we have to also contact people who are not directly affected with it, we have to create solidarity. And I want to ask you, like, how do you feel the process changed? And I also want to ask you how you see yourself, like, are you an initiator in a collective? Is it open, like, can anybody who wants to get like an initiator as well, or do you see yourself more like as a logistics rainmaker?
I'm not sure I understand the difference between the two. So the process grew because I, like, as you said in the beginning, I already did this in 2020.
Yeah.
And there I, for a very personal reason, I didn't have the same amount of time. Like, now I get the luxury of living with a grant, which means I can focus 100% on art making. And last year that was not the case. So I had, on a very practical level, less time to dedicate to the project. And that also means less time to guarantee all these frameworks of safety that I think are important.
Yes.
And on the other hand, I also think that things developing and growing slowly, and you having the chance to do some trial runs is important for then the growth also be sustainable. And then a very macro political reason for the project to have grown is the fall of the Afghani government to the Taliban after the retreat of the American army. Like, this also made, and like this explosion of visibility of Afghanistan for like 3 or 4 weeks, and then complete disappearance of the mediatic landscape again, until again recently with the protests of Afghani women because of education. Like, this was, I think this made it definitely feel more urgent. And then because I was already had some chances to practice little aesthetical solutions on the field and how to structure a pickup or planting action, it also made it easier to then scale it up by bringing in new organizations and different types of intersections.
But also, like, I remember that when Afghanistan fell, there was also a lot of discussion about white saviorism and how we reproduce pictures in the media. What does it mean? Like, which bodies can, through media or through the perception of media, be in pain, and who can mourn, who cannot, like in a like politicization of like all of this. And I want you to ask, like, how do you position yourself in this, and what is the consequence for your project?
I mean, the danger of white saviorism for white red bodies articulating or wanting to articulate, I'm going to say wanting to because it's not always successful, wanting to articulate strategies for solidarity is always a very big danger. And it's definitely a very big concern. The way, also going back to your previous question, I think that's why I position myself more as a coordinator than an artist within this context, and why there's no showing of any Afghani bodies in the website or overt show or like a differentiated show of Afghani bodies in the documentation for the video. If this makes sense, like I don't think that's something that I'm entitled to impose, and that's not also something that is like speaking on the Afghani experience is not my place. Basically, like that's an experience I didn't share. And in the different contexts and the different organizations that I structured planting actions with, what it was about showing the Afghani experience, it was by Afghani artists. So we had a poetry reading at the end of one of the planting actions when we showed a tier. Frishte Sarati did a show of her video documenting the way that it felt to see the government fall, and she runs a school for women in Kabul with her sister, and to then be worried about the safety of the women at her school and her family, and this is what I think is the right thing to do. So you use your tools and the platforms you have access to try to open space for then the voices of the people directly affected to be able to use that space in the way that they choose. But you're not being the gaze that's framing it. You're not being the curator. You're not being the person. You're not the person deciding what gets shown or what gets said or how it gets shown or said. You just say, so, hey, I'm doing this. You want to mitmachen? Amazing. Now this is completely your space.
And here I want to ask you, like, there's a documentation shown in the space, and I would like to ask you, it's like not yours, it's from a different artist. Can you please repeat the name?
Emilia Tamburini.
And I would love to know, like, how did you work with the Emilio, and what was like their feedback, and how is it to work with other artists also in a frame that you create together?
So working with Emilio was again one of these very fortunate encounters. He's a part of one of the activist groups that also participated and co-organized some planting actions in Berlin. And he was interested in the project and offered to do the video documentation for it. And he took a more artistic approach to it. So it's not this strict narrative of what happened with this interview format. And we also, for me, it was very important to think about what type of imagery we're showing, because the how do you say Aufenthalt in German in English? Like the legal framing with which the participants are in Germany at the moment is very diverse. So for some people, it's completely safe to be there planting outside and to be identifiable in this, in like the documentation of these actions. And for some people, it was not. And it was important for me that we're not differentiating between the voice and the visibility that the participants have because of the oppression and invisibility that the system already puts them under. So when we were discussing how to do the documentation, I said that for me it was important that like close-ups of faces or close-up interviews was not a tool.
Yes.
And that we rather showed hands working on the earth or the actual plants once they have grown a little bit, or feet or legs, or if we're showing the people then from very, very far away. So this was the strategy that we chose. And then I think it's also important here to talk about how then this footage is filtered according to the context where it is shown. Because to put close-ups of hands online is still by people that are ill-intentioned a form of identification. So there's no images of hands in any perspective on the website or the material distributed about the project. On the exhibition space, this is a different context where only the people that are physically present have access to, so the cut of the image was already possible to be made differently. The faces are still not a thing that is shown. And then on one of the planting actions we had Afghan poets reading some of their poetry. So we have in the first part of the video, just an explanation of the project in voice-off and this actions of planting with this type of visual language. And then Emilio overlapped the poem of Sara Spartak with some close-up images of tulips, and then he showed the poem in a third moment with the English translation overlapped with the already growing tulips in the place where he planted them the biggest amount, 1,000. Yeah, so a lot of them.
Wow.
And yeah, and this for me is like, this is his work, his language, his creative decisions. The one thing that was important for me again was that everyone was treated through the same aesthetical presets, that there wasn't this differentiation of bodies and visibility and voice based on legal framing, and that people were able to do it safely.
And also, like, you two working together is, I think, also like stressing part of the whole project that I think is very important and very like a harsh point. And what I want to like hear from you is this, like, how does this project give space at the one hand for allyship and for solidarity, which you stressed, like, but also of course to people who are affected and who want to, we talked yesterday about mourning maybe, but also like giving a space to be in a space where you have like all people on the same page. You're together with the same problems, for example, and you're coming together from like different angles. You talked about different Vereine, what is the word? Like different
organizations,
coming like from different intersectional intersections coming together. And I want you to like talk a bit more about people coming together in this way.
Can you be a bit more specific?
Yeah, I think so. Well, what I'm stressing on is how do you make a project with this very sensitive topic that is not only for white allyship and that does not only stress white allyship, but that does stress like all this frustration over like the different, like how do we discuss like border issues now with like Ukrainian refugees versus how we discussed it with Afghani refugees, like and all these feelings and frustration and like being effective. And this is like what I'm asking, how do you do this project without maybe letting it slip, I ask now provocative, into this wide allyship presenting like performance? this is like the provocative questions. I don't say that it's happening, but this is what I'm like stressing on.
No, and honestly, there for me, the answer is quite simple. It just can't all be white creative input. Like, it ends there. It can't just be us white red people participating or doing parts of the project, deciding all the directions that it will take. You know, it's also allowing other people to own parts of it. Like, I got asked by the, how do you say this in English? Yeah, the work group, the Afghani work group from the Zeebrugge Oldenburg, to send tulips to a Kundgebung in Bremen because they thought this was a different political language that could maybe catch on to what they were trying to say in that context. And in that context, the tulips are a annex, are a Zusatz. Like, they're not taking main stage as this performance of solidarity. They're just another tool for solidarity or political statements that people in that context at that demo organized by a completely different group can take. Same thing with Simorg. They organized a Persian New Year festival also in Prinzessengarten in Berlin, and Frisch, they asked if they could also have some tulips there because of the significance with the Persian New Year. So I brought some tulips there, and then I left Kufa for someone else, and they were again just a Zusatz, just present there for whoever wanted to take them and plant them, but they weren't any type of performance of solidarity or taking any type of center stage. Like, the center stage was still the music and the food and everything else that was prepared. And for me, I think this is what's necessary. Like, you need to be okay with not being in the center and commanding the center all the time. You need to make the tools that you develop available for different contexts. You need necessarily to not just to have actors that are not just these white Europeans standing on or feeling like they're bystanders to a certain problematic. And you need to have not just listen, like to have the people that are affected by these problems decide how these tools also get used. And yeah, for me, I think this is what's important. And I was having a conversation about also this topic of white saviorism and performativity of solidarity with someone else a few days ago. And I feel like a difficult and not talked about enough remnant of colonialism in our mind frame is this idea that us as Europeans have the capacity to comprehend and fix all problems everywhere, even though they're not positioned from within our perspective, and we can just go somewhere and understand the problem and fix it. And no, this is not true. What I think we can do is understand how much we are contributing to the problem or the violence and position ourselves against it. And this is more how I look at this work, because I think our governments are reinforcing these types of legal and bureaucratical violences on other people and other people's bodies, and they're doing this in our name. There are our elected officials, and it's important that we say that this is not in our name and that this is not something that we're okay with. So I see it more as, or maybe not more, but also very much as an act of resistance.
Can I ask you if you see yourself, like, how do you stand, if I can ask provocative, are you here an artist or are you an activist? Is this the same for you? Like, how
I don't
how
know.
does this feel?
I never know. I never know, and sometimes it's very uncomfortable. Because I think both in art and activism, you want to propose different models of sociability. And you want to, I think in art, maybe you get to be a bit more utopic than in activism when you're dealing with very, very practical problems and violences and crises and questions. Maybe, I'm not sure, but I don't know. I have a very hard time in myself differentiating the two. And I think a lot of tools from one environment can travel productively to the other and vice versa. Like the space for reflection and posing questions and testing out unlikely scenarios that we have in art is something that can also provide tools for activism, and activism can also be a good remedy for this thing that often happens inside the art world and the art bubble and all our art theory brainy discussions, which is losing the clarity of the use that this should have for people's lives. Like this sense of we are also like being an artist is a job, because not just because it's lovely for us, it has a use for people and it has a role to play. And there it can have as many versions of this as there are artists, but it's important that we pose ourselves the question of how we want what we make, what we create, to interact with the broader world, and what type of connections and questions do we want it to open, and which type of possibilities do we want it to propose.
It stressed so much how I feel like how important in your work is interaction and also being active, or like getting shown a frame where I can act, or like where it's easier to get out of this like not numbness but like being frozen. I feel like this is what I see in this work also, and I feel like this is what I see, what you want to do and where you want to go. I'm a bit curious, like what you plan in the future, or what are the next steps in the Tulip project, and how will it all evolve, and if you ever considered to let it grow alone, for example.
That would be my dream. I would love to if it became this autonomous thing that has its own life apart from me, because it's also on a lot of aspects, it's also a very draining process. So this would be lovely. The two things that I see myself is like there's an opening of this big tulip cluster to organize now for the spring. They were still not bloomed when I left Berlin to come to Osnabrück, but maybe they already bloomed. So this is something to organize very soon. And then for autumn, I would like to be able to find a couple of places around Germany where it would be possible to have a fixed version of the memorial. So within possibly here cultural space or institution context would be easier than municipal political context. Also because I feel very uneasy about working with municipalities on this, or like political power on this. It's not an option that it's not an option that I'm for at the moment. Maybe I change my mind, but right now I think art with very overtly political goals get so often co-opted as a way of masking and atoning for political inaction and guilt. And this is a position I don't want to find myself in again. So I think for the autumn that would kind of be the goal. And then on the digital database for the project, I have this mini feasible dream of having an open archive for the Afghani cultural producers and community at large to be able to upload the things that they think deserve to be remembered. And so there being physical places for like physical fests, permanent places for the memorial to be installed. Then there could also be a Zugang through a QR code or whatever else to this archive. And it's something that I started discussing with two Afghani artists in Hamburg already, and I think it makes sense. But we'll see. Logistically, it's also a bit more complex.
I think here is a good point to maybe show the website.
Okay.
So we did a few screenshots. You can see here. This is, I think, the starting point.
Yeah, and it starts with one of the images from Emilio.
And here you can, for example, see how somebody grabs a plant to plant. What is the web address? Maybe people want to look it up.
So I just want to say that like the images that were shown, one of them is by Emilia Tamburini, the other one is by Hassan Amiri from Zeebrugge Oldenburg. The flower box was how they were distributing the flowers at the Kundgebung. And the website domain is onetulip1person.com. Yeah.
Is there something you feel like has to be added to the talk, or that I maybe didn't ask you?
Yes, there is. So, if you are a person that after this talk cares a little bit more about this issue, get informed about the local dynamics of Aufenthalt and Duldung statuses and Afghani rights in your area, and whether it is by volunteering or joining an activist group or joining a support group for someone struggling through this type of constricting, oppressive system, this makes a difference, and it's easier to do locally than on a macro level. Mm-hmm. And if you're someone that is going through this and you feel you have the capacity for it, and I want to stress you feel you have the capacity for it because these processes are obviously psychologically draining, it is worth it reaching out to your friends and the people that care about you.
Thank you for stressing that again. I think in case you don't have to add something more, I would really like to thank you. I was a bit nervous because it was our second talk already. And yeah, but I hope now it's online and you can all hear us when we say goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.